Chapter 5. 4 days later, Madelyn was forced to admit that the Duke of Wolverest was a man of his word. Truly, she hadn't caught a glimpse of him since the abrupt conclusion of her interview. The man had seemingly dissolved into a mist, quite like the ever-present haze that perpetually clung to the various domes and chimney stacks of his castle. And like the mist, the Duke's brooding existence was always sensed by her, always considered. She thought, or hoped, that perhaps the deceiver had simply left, that maybe he went to a hunting lodge miles and miles away. Sometimes she thought he might have gone to London to hunt down an actress or an opera singer. Mostly, though, she thought that she shouldn't be thinking about him so much. And what was it again he had said in the orangery? Oh yes, his intriguing statement that implied he had thought it necessary to give up a mistress for a wife. Could he have meant that? Or had she misconstrued his words? Well, she did know one thing. She really shouldn't care. With black paper and scissors in hand, Madelyn reflected on this as she stood in her bedchamber, studying Charlotte's profile. Her impatient friend sat in a Heppel-white chair before one of the tall windows overlooking the topiary garden and the great expanse of the south lawn beyond.
"Are you almost done?"
Charlotte asked, throwing an anxious glance toward the window.
"The archery lesson is to begin in nearly 5 minutes. We'll be late."
"1 more minute now, shush,"
Madelyn replied, her concentrated gaze bouncing from paper to profile as she busily snipped her friend's silhouette.
"Madelyn,"
Charlotte pleaded.
"you promised this wouldn't take long. I've a mind to think you're doing this on purpose."
"Oh, for heaven's sake, I'm not keeping you from Lord Tristan,"
Madelyn insisted, continuing to concentrate on her work.
"See? You knew exactly what I was thinking. You are trying to keep me from him. Admit it."
"Don't be silly, Lottie. Besides, the ever-courteous Lord Tristan will surely wait for you."
"Do you know,"
Charlotte said quietly,
"I find it rather unfair none of the other girls like him as much as I do. Yet he awards them more attention."
Madelyn gave a disbelieving huff of laughter.
"That's not true."
"Oh, it certainly is. When we were on our way to the picnic yesterday, and we encountered that old footbridge with a rotted plank, he offered a hand of support to each of them in turn but failed to assist me."
"You are forgetting that you and I used our own good sense and simply stepped over the last board."
Madelyn made a final snip.
"Certainly, had you fretted like a pea-goose, he'd have aided you across as well."
Her spine straight with indignation, Charlotte hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Clearly she was loath to relinquish the imagined slight.
"There, 'tis finished,"
Madelyn said, holding up the profile of her friend seated in the elegant chair.
"After I finish the rest of the silhouettes, Lady Rosalind claims she'll have them all framed."
The bedchamber door opened behind Madelyn. She turned to see Priscilla sweep into the room, tugging on lace gloves.
"Still cutting pictures, Madelyn?"
Priscilla shook her head in disdain. Her stepmother was obviously still a bit irked with her abbreviated explanation of her initial run-in with the Duke. But if anything, Priscilla was ever hopeful the interlude put her ward a step closer to marital entrapment.
"The other girls have already begun to assemble,"
Priscilla said with an expectant look.
"'Tis not so wise to disregard the Devine's schedule. As I recollect, were you not late in coming to the picnic yesterday afternoon?"
"That was no fault of my own,"
Madelyn answered, returning her scissors to its case.
"I explained that to you yesterday."
"Nonsense, couldn't find your shoes?"
She clucked her tongue.
"Come now, you can produce a better excuse."
"Someone hid all of my shoes."
"That's ridiculous."
"I agree,"
Madelyn cried out.
"I drank the posset left out on the table with a note from the housekeeper advising me to drink up, as it would relieve any lingering swelling from the sting. Strong stuff, that was. I fell asleep within an instant. When I awoke, poof, my shoes were missing. If it wasn't for Jenny happening upon them in a vacant room down the hall, I'd be barefoot right now."
"Well, you shouldn't have wasted time looking for them and simply borrowed a pair from me."
"They wouldn't have fit, just like every borrowed—"
"Pardon?"
Charlotte exclaimed.
But it seems we'll be late for the archery lesson as well.
Priscilla gave Charlotte a squinty look before she turned back into the hall.
Come, girls, we'll fetch Mrs. Green and walk you both down on our way to tea with the other chaperones.
Charlotte immediately rose to follow the Baroness, but hesitated after realising Madelyn hadn't joined them.
You are coming?
Her friend asked, worry evident in her gaze.
I shan't survive without you there. No spectacles, you know. I'm very likely to kill someone by mistake without you there to guide me.
True. Very true.
Madelyn looked about the floor, noting the black slivers of paper dotting the cream and blue rug.
Go on ahead. I'll tidy up a bit first. Don't aim at anything until I get there.
Please hurry along,
Charlotte said with a beseeching glance, then turned to leave, shutting the door quietly behind her. Madelyn sunk down to her knees to pluck the scraps from the rug. Using one hand like a bowl, she collected the bits of paper. There was a clicking sound at the door. Assuming it was an anxious Charlotte, she didn't bother turning around when she called out,
Almost done.
She stood, walked over to a tray set on a nearby table, and dusted the bits onto a napkin. Bending to tighten the laces of her half-boots, she plucked her pelisse off a chair, then hurried over to the door and turned the handle. The door wouldn't open. She jiggled the handle and jerked with all her strength for a second time, but it remained firmly shut. Someone had locked her in her room, and the only person who had a key was her stepmother. But why would Priscilla lock her in her room? Her brows knitted together, Madelyn went to the door of their connecting dressing room, thinking to leave through her stepmother's chamber. She reached for the handle and groaned in frustration. It wouldn't budge either. She sighed, slumping against the wall. What an odd predicament she found herself in. She had quite unexpectedly become imprisoned, for a short while anyway. For a moment she contemplated shouting at the top of her lungs, but the inner castle walls were much too thick. No one could possibly hear her screams. Besides, there was no one to hear her. The chaperones were meeting with Lady Rosalind for tea in her salon, and no one else would be returning to their rooms until after the archery lesson. And who knew how long that could be? Pushing off of the wall, she strolled back into her room. In truth, she wouldn't have minded the solitude, the brief respite from the nausea brought on by Lord Tristan's practised sincerity and his gaggle of silly admirers. And Charlotte could surely handle the other girls. But not Lord Tristan. All he'd have to do is give Lottie a lopsided grin and a crook of his finger, and her friend would go wherever he led. The man presented a wicked assortment of dangers. No, she couldn't leave Charlotte alone in that man's company for a second. Madelyn's fingertips tapped at her chin while she weighed her options. She could simply sit here like some cow-eyed fairy tale princess and await someone to rescue her from the castle tower, or her fingers stilled as her gaze swung to the tall windows. A breath of excitement whispered within her breast. Would she dare? A seed of an idea blooming in her eye, she strode over to her bed. Flipping the coverlet out of her way, she tugged at the underlying linen sheets. Her room was only on the second floor, and she certainly wasn't so silly as to be afraid of heights. Yorkshire was incomparable, Gabriel thought as he sauntered through the topiary garden upon returning from surveying his grounds. Oh, there were many who found the vacant moors desolate and dull. It had none of the conveniences of London, nor the splendour of Bath, but it was here that he played as a child, well before the responsibility of being the heir to a dukedom took over his choices, and well before the task of acting father to an impish young Tristan took over his life. When he returned to Wolverest from a tedious session of Parliament, the serenity and familiarity of the land quieted his mind, assured his being. But what kept him coming back, what kept him from retiring to one of his other numerous properties instead, was this high country's hidden treasures. Indeed, Gabriel knew it wasn't all just empty green fields of moorland grass for miles around. Tucked within the wide landscapes of these uplands was an unpredictability that a less observant person might never be aware of. There were waterfalls concealed in swaths of wilderness, rocky stream beds rambling in deep valleys, and knotted sheets.
What, in God's name?
Gabriel blinked, and blinked again. No, it wasn't a trick of his imagination. Knotted sheets were being lowered out of a second-floor window of his castle. Breaking into a sprint, he dashed down a row of hedges trimmed into the shapes of various waterfowl and stopped just beneath the window. A dark green pelisse flew from the open window, sailed down and slapped him in the face. He removed the offending fabric, which he noted possessed an alluringly feminine scent of rose and mint, and tossed it over a hedge. A stocking-enclosed leg swung over the sill, followed by the other, both feet successfully finding a foothold in the old stone tower. Astonished, Gabriel's sharp gaze settled on familiar red tresses with thick, wild curls escaping the top bun. His jaw tightened in response. What the bloody hell was she doing now? He took 2 steps forward in an effort to be in the most beneficial position should his little deserter fall. To his surprise, Miss Haywood continued to unerringly shimmy her way down the wall, using the knotted sheet as support. As he admired her agility, he realized the back hem of her pale yellow dress had been joined with the front, then yanked up from the bottom to her waist, affording her the benefits of makeshift breeches, and insurmountable modesty, considering the luscious view a fluttering skirt above his head would have afforded him. About the time her booted feet were at his eye level, the toes of her right foot searched in vain for a proper foothold. It must be difficult, he mused, to be able to see down over the swell of a gathered skirt. He grinned as her toes pointed left and right, scraping back and forth against the stone as they hunted for a niche in the wall. She let forth a mild curse, then, without further warning, pushed off from the wall with her other foot. Apparently Miss Haywood was giving herself ample room in preparation to jump the rest of the way down. He had only half of a second to react, bracing his legs wide apart. She jumped directly into him, her back colliding with his chest. His arms reflexively wrapped around her middle as the two of them flew backward onto the lawn, his body cushioning her fall. Letting out a shriek, she spun within his hold, but remained sprawled atop him. Her thighs straddling his hips, her breasts pressed tightly to his chest, her nose an inch above his own.
Good Lord, what are you doing here?
She asked.
Apparently I'm saving you from a broken ankle, to the detriment of my health.
He said with a grunt, unable to ignore how well she cradled the mould of his body. Reflexively, he slid his hands up and then back down the span of her back. She squirmed, unknowingly nestling him farther within her thighs. His breath hitched.
Are you all right?
She asked with sincere concern. One corner of his mouth lifted into a grin as he realized she was, as of yet, utterly oblivious to their erotic position. Unable to trust himself, Gabriel reluctantly loosened his hold, then released it, dropping his hands to his sides.
I'm fine, I believe. You?
She nodded. Surprising him, her gaze warmed, travelling down to his mouth. An urge ignited within him to lift his chin and take possession of her mouth, her lips. But he suspected he wouldn't be able to stop there.
May I ask what you were trying to do?
He asked instead, the tone of his voice just above a throaty growl.
The, archery lesson,
She said softly.
It's starting. I was late, and my stepmother must have accidentally locked me in my room.
He glanced at the dangling sheet.
You must have really wanted to go.
His comment brought her gaze back up to connect with his. Pressing his lips together, he fought valiantly to keep from laughing, but in the end, he couldn't keep a low chuckle from rumbling in his chest. The movement of his mirth made her entire upper body bounce up and down. Her face burned red with a feverish blush, as she only then noticed their wicked position.
Unhand me.
Miss Haywood, if you paid any attention at all,
He said, a smile softening his words.
you would have noticed long ago that there is nothing keeping you from getting off of me.
She glanced down, realizing with a visual start that his arms indeed remained at his sides. She rolled away, scrambling up to stand.
Aren't you going to thank me?
Gabriel asked, raising up to lean back on his elbows. Something shifted inside him. His heart felt lighter, and he realized he no longer sounded like himself. By God, he was actually teasing the woman. Again. Patting at her hair, she raised her chin to a haughty angle.
For what?
Saving you.
I'd sooner marry your brother.
Promises, promises.
He mumbled. With a loud sigh, she presented her back to him and marched away.
You've forgotten something.
Gabriel called out. She turned back like an angry whip.
What have I forgotten?
Not waiting for his answer, her eyes flew to the hedge where he had thrown her pelisse. She collected it, then stomped off again.
That's not what you've forgotten,
he said, crossing his ankles and smiling like a scoundrel. She stopped, turning to face him with an annoyed glance.
Yes?
He cleared his throat, blinking slowly.
Are you going to tell me, or is this some sort of game and I should guess?
He cleared his throat, blinking slowly.
Your skirt.
After a small gasp, she looked down at the knot of fabric pinned to her waist and her exposed, stocking-enclosed calves. Hurriedly, she released the pins, allowing the skirts to fall into the proper place. For a moment, Gabriel regretted pointing out her predicament so boldly. Good Lord, if she started to cry, he didn't know what the hell he'd do. But then she looked at him, and instead of embarrassment, irritation, or a pout, real or practiced, her mouth wobbled with a suppressed bubble of laughter. Any other woman would have burst into tears or swooned with mortification.
Well, thank you.
She mumbled. Presenting her back to him, she walked on stiffly, swinging her coat at her side as she tried to pretend nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. Gabriel let out an airy whistle as he observed the sway of her hips while she made her way up a far hill to join the assembled group of women. The memory of the unexpected spark of heat forming between their bodies as she lay sprawled atop him would surely plague him for the remainder of the day and into the depths of the night. But it was nothing he couldn't manage to restrain. His willpower was strong. Frustrated, he looked away from the sight of her, choosing instead to focus on the knotted sheets swaying in the breeze. Plenty of women had thrown themselves at him for years. Some he had welcomed with open arms, others, the naive innocents, he gently declined. But no woman had ever dropped out of a window into his arms, knocking the very air from his lungs and forcing him to acknowledge an attraction he'd rather ignore. He'd never seen anything like Miss Haywood in his life. He'd never felt so unprepared. He shook his head. Foolish woman, nearly got herself killed. And all for an archery lesson. It didn't make any sense. She told him herself she had no interest in marrying into his family. Then she went and risked her life, her bones at the very least, to make certain she got to attend a function with Tristan. Simply illogical. Perhaps he was wrong to believe in her disinterest. He rubbed his chin in thought. Perhaps he would keep a closer eye on Miss Haywood, starting right now. He stood and brushed himself off. Glancing over his shoulder, he caught one more glance of her retreating form before she crested a hill and slipped out of his line of vision. Illogical and dangerously intriguing. He must keep his distance, he told himself, and yet find a way to observe her every move at the same time. He could do it. All he needed was determination, discipline, and a lot of brandy.
What is Papa?